Welcome to Red Eye Story Hour for Tales Told After Midnight. I'm your host and author, R.J. Burley. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you wish to support my work, please buy my books in the links in the description. Thank you. I dedicate this story to my friend, Mark Ernst. I served with him in the Marine Corps. He was one of the first to buy my novels, and he gave me feedback on the story that you are about to hear. This is my first story about a recurring character, Gil Sullivan, who appears in many of my short stories and plays a short but key role in my novel series, The Mountain Warriors. For content warning, this intensity is more like the action of Indiana Jones rather than horror that inspires a sleepless night. Title: Night Stalker of the Pyramid. From the FBI files. This manuscript was found in paranormal investigator Gil Sullivan's records during an investigation for his disappearance, although the time documented of its writing is a few years before his mysterious disappearance, and has little validation in the current investigation. It is still interesting nonetheless, and helps explain another mystery. I am Gil Sullivan, a paranormal investigator. I freelance and tend to be hired by people who do not wish for the horrors of their lives to be well known. In other words, they don't want fame, but rather the truth. I prefer these clients because they tend to be the most credible. Doesn't pay well in money, but it's worth a fortune to satisfy my curiosity of the unknown. Like my clients, I also seek out the truth, not the fickle veneer of fanfare. The other reason I prefer these clients is that to arrive at a scene to investigate that which has remained elusive for years, even back to the antediluvian era, before the Great Flood, an investigator can't show up with a crew of 20-plus people, light up the night as if day, and be a corporeal nuisance to the eldritch presence. I am a former recon Marine and hunted the forest in my youth. I tend to blend in and become part of the local surroundings. I would be like a snake, laying in the leaves, on the forest floor for hours or even days, a perched bird on a high branch, or a fly on the wall if possible. A recent story fascinated me. I had read about the findings of a ruin from an ancient indigenous community that dated back in time to 1,500 years ago in a wild jungle-choked area called the Darien Gap of Panama. Nearly impenetrable, it hid drug gangs, deadly snakes, and other horrors in its bramble-entangled bosom. Thousands have disappeared in this mysterious strip of land. The long-told legends gave it the title of the world's most dangerous jungle. The forest not only mysteriously claims the lives of people today, but its soil had literally swallowed a pyramid. Recently, sonar equipment had demonstrated the pyramid's size beneath the dirt rivaled that of the great Mayan pyramid of Cholula. But the investigation had only led to perplexing questions, such as why was it buried so that it appeared as an insignificant hill in the jungle? Because of my past studies, I was one of the few who asked the question of who or what had buried it, and then why was it concealed? However, although fascinated, archaeology was not my field, but rather a hobby interest. I followed the stories in the news with a distant curiosity. That changed when I received a call to investigate. Archaeologists began to disappear during the night, and then locals, further from the dig site, began to vanish as well. It was as if some unholy creature had been aroused. Although nighttime disappearances weren't too uncommon in the Darien Gap, it was suddenly happening in far greater numbers. I received a call after a body was discovered. The victim had been gnawed and gouged by great teeth and razor claws that had to be the size and sharpness of combat knives. That evening, the village police had followed the bloody drag marks through the leaves. No one else dared to follow the officers into the nighttime jungle. The 3 policemen were never seen again. All that was found was a body cam from one of the missing officers and more bloody drag marks that again no one dared follow. The body camera video was emailed to me, but all I could see were bumping flashes of light and dark shapes and shadows spinning at a wild pace from the panic. I heard the curses of men and the savage reports of handguns that blazed orange in the night. Then screams of mortal terror amid savage growling and snarling. Although the video was written off as a hoax by some investigators, I believed it was real because the shrill screams of the men told me of the fight to stay not just alive but sane in the presence of abysmal horror. The voices struck me as so renderingly genuine. I could not believe it could be faked, even by the best actors, let alone 3 backwoods officers. Nothing against those who live on the remaining frontiers, but those type of men tended to be tough and blunt. I drove into Yavisa, the small village on the edge of the Darien Gap, arriving at 0:30 within 2 days of this attack. I was taken to the local morgue by the local police chief, Ramos, where I studied the first body that was discovered by the 3 disappeared police officers. And despite my jaded disposition, even my stomach was turned at the horrendous bloody destruction inflicted on the person. There were deep punctures caused by rodent-like incisors and slashed by claws that came in sets of 4 deep gouges. Despite the shredded appearance, the body was largely intact, telling me that it was not consumed, but instead ravaged by something that was full of intense and unbridled hatred for the intruders. I heard rumors of the chupacabra, I said to the police chief in a tone as neutral as I could manage. He was an older man, slightly overweight, but there was a hardness beneath that told me he was still a man near his prime. In his eyes I could see courage, but I could tell that something had rattled him hard. I have been around a bit and can read a person quite well. The police chief, who was tired from the waking hours, responded equally neutral. "Wolverine," he said as he made a fist and imitated slashing the air like the comic book hero. He sipped his coffee and looked piercingly at me with a hint of something that I couldn't tell if it was humor or cynical irony, probably both. "Do you find this funny, Senor?" I asked. "These policemen were my friends. Good men," he replied, holding my stare. "Entiendo. Hermanos." I said the Spanish words that I understood. They were brothers. I got the dark humor that men of action tended to employ. The conversation was a bit awkward, probably due to the late hour. But others look to them for answers, and if society sees them break down in tears, society falls apart. A lot rests on their tired shoulders, and sometimes dark humor is all that helps them keep it together. "Sí, hablas español?" he asked. "Un poco," I said. "But you seem to speak better English," I replied, hoping to stick to my native tongue so not to embarrass myself with my horrible Spanish. He nodded. I expected him to say something, but instead he just studied his coffee in a clay cup, likely made by a local artisan. After an awkward silence, I opened my mouth to say something, but he suddenly said, "My people look to me for answers. What does the answer man do when he has no answer?" "He calls me," I said with a half smile. He laughed ruefully and looked over his coffee, out the window, as the morning sun broke above the emerald jungle. "I will show you where the body was found." I looked at the sunrise and realized that he was waiting for daylight before leaving the safety of the office. We left town, and he drove me a few miles down a weedy clearing that might once have been a gravel road, but the tenacious jungle worked hard to take back what man had once claimed. As he drove, he said, "You think me a coward for not joining you on this venture into the jungle?" "No, I can see that you are made of steel," I replied. He took his eyes off the road, and then nodded when he saw that I was sincere. "Then, senor," he said with conviction, "you believe us to be backwater, superstitious, how do you say, yokels?" No, I began. But he cut me off with a snorting laugh as he looked me in the eyes. We held the stare until one of the many bumps in the road shook our attention back to the road. He could see that I was telling a polite lie, but a lie nonetheless. He said, I worked for the Department of the Interior. I was pretty high-ranking and worked with your national alphabet soups and the drug wars and other episodes that I cannot comment on due to the nature of their confidentiality. I retired and came out here as a cop for some adventure, of course, but mostly to relax and to enjoy my kids and grandkids. That enjoyment is what life is really all about. I nodded, but said nothing. I really preferred silence. My mind was focused on the investigation ahead. I specifically requested you, he said. I could not keep the surprise from registering on my face. My file was top secret in the Pentagon. He nodded. For a long time, I have read about your adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but also about the werewolf you killed, that demon thing, examining the doorway, I interrupted. The werewolf technically wasn't a real werewolf. Of course, he said, but the savagery was real, and something really did kill my men. And you don't want vengeance? Senor, everything was peaceful as long as we honored the warnings of the local tribes. Whatever killed my men was happy to leave us alone as long as we left it alone. I don't want vengeance. I want to leave whatever it is alone and return to normal. Then why did you request me to investigate? I asked. Because your recommendations will be honored. My recommendation to you would be to camp far from that accursed place. As the good book says, a prophet is not recognized as a prophet in his hometown. Your word will be believed, not mine. I nodded, feeling a slight twinge of guilt. He nodded grimly, acknowledging my discomfort, and said, the pyramid never should have been investigated. Something buried it for a reason. Something, I asked. He said what I was thinking, but instead of scaring me, it only intrigued me more. I was willing to risk my life to understand the unknown secrets of the world. He nodded his head grimly and said, I know a beautiful waterfall not far away. There is no death, only beauty. After a few days of relaxing, come back, tell people to stay away. I will sign off, and it will be peaceful again. They will listen to you. I looked at him in shock. I am confused. You don't strike me as a coward. Why don't you want to avenge your men's death? I am a peace officer, he said with a sigh, and repeated, annoyed that I basically ignored him when he explained earlier. I want peace for my grandkids. And we were at peace. My officers wanted to keep it that way too. We respected the warnings of the local tribes. Then outsiders, the archaeologists, woke up what should have slept. Only death awaits in the jungle. I suggest you leave and let things turn as they were. I cannot do that, Senor, I said with conviction. My career field was full of enough flakes. That my word was believed meant everything to me. Unfortunately, I knew you would say that, and I regret sending you to your death. No one has survived a night where you go. But this is your choice from this point onward, Senor. You will only stir it up even more. My officers knew this and wished it to sleep, but they felt duty called them, similar to you. Everyone in the town wants to move on. It's only the outsiders, like yourself, who want an answer. Because you don't live next to it, you can only go home. This is my home. He came to the stop at the edge of the jungle and said, we are here. You need not go through with this. You can say anything, and I will call it the official truth. Let it go back to sleep. Thanks for the ride, I said. I jumped out and grabbed my gear. He nodded his head sadly and waved goodbye. I set out into the jungle and made my way to the site of the policeman's disappearance. There had been a storm the night before, and the wind had stirred the leaves like a witch's brew, so that any trace of violence was gone and reclaimed by the jungle that acted like a sentient and brutally reclusive being at times. I Then followed the reported direction where the bloody bodies were dragged. I was soon in the heart of where no one had survived an evening in recent times. I continued into a valley that skirted the newly discovered pyramid. Despite my temptation to explore the new find, I purposely stayed on the periphery and then climbed a small hill to find a place to set up my observation post for the evening. After establishing my hide, I walked down to explore a small creek, looking for footprints of any creature that would come to drink. But all the sand and dirt was wet and fresh from the storm. I could see that the creek had been washed clean from the night before and was slowly lowering to its regular depth. I either walked through the underbrush or on stony areas so as not to leave my own boot prints. As I explored the area, a buzzing sound grew louder as I approached a small leaf-covered mound. The sound was so furious. It sounded like a distant approach of a squadron of propeller-driven fighter planes. I stepped closer and made a face, as I could see a horde of flies buzzing around, and caught the putrid scent of deathly decay. Beneath the cover of the leaves, I knew what the mound was constructed of, but I still had to kick off the loose foliage. Someone or something had quickly buried the carcasses. I made a face as I saw the rotting flesh of the 3 bloated police officers and looked at the savage claw marks and slices now blackened with dried blood. The bodies were mauled by something that did not consume the flesh. I was about 2 miles from the drop-off point. The remoteness of the kill site hit me hard. I was alone, and I felt it. But that was my chosen lot in life. I stepped away from the malodorous pile of former humanity and marked a place on the map for others to find so that the family could have their finality. And then I moved back up to the hill for my lookout. This hideous job of recovering the bodies belonged to someone else. My job was to find what caused the death. It was past noon when I got to my observation post. It overlooked the valley with an area that wasn't too choked with brush and afforded me a view of a few hundred meters. I couldn't find any well-traveled animal trails, but this was a good area to afford travel for any local fauna, so I finished setting up my camouflage around my observation post and settled in. With a few hours before sunset, I managed to get a bit of sleep despite the swarm of mosquitoes that found their way through my defenses. I awoke as the birds and insects began their song to bid farewell to the setting sun. Some of the tunes were pleasant invocations. Others sounded like screeching curses. I debated whether to take some energy pills that I mixed for myself. The capsules had a combination of caffeine, ginseng, vitamins, and some nutrients that I added. However, I found myself wide awake, and my nerves seemed to be abuzz with the eldritch portent that seemed to tingle in the mysterious nightly air, and I feared that caffeine would make me even more fidgety and worrisome. The night passed slowly. I lay on my belly with a handgun in my right hand and a flashlight that was turned off in my left. I lay in the dark jungle alone with a deep-seated dread. I pondered the weight of the supernatural uncertainty that gathered in the pit of my stomach. That uncertainty had a hint of existential questioning that became more bearable each time facing new investigations, and oddly addictive. However, it still took its toll. I always had an interest in the rumors of the arcane happenings of the world, but these investigations had become something personal, as well as a new career in the last year after the mysterious death of a childhood friend. My search for the uncanny paid me enough to survive, but because I am just a one-man show, I tend to have more success finding things than earning a living. It was a hard-scrabble life with no benefits other than personal satisfaction, but I would not have it any other way. The time was all that crept by for the first part of the night. I wiped my sweaty brow and checked the time. It was just after midnight. The full moon eerily lit the jungle like a pale and sickly sun. I had great natural night vision. I took bilberry and other supplements for eyesight, slept in total darkness, and did exercise so I could lessen my dependence on artificial light. But I also had night vision goggles, which were laying next to me. But this clear night made it easy to see without their help. It was a little after midnight when I heard a slow but consistent rustle in the leaves beside me. I turned, expecting to see an insect. I told myself that it was a tarantula, so to calm myself if I faced the worst. But it was even worse than that. I saw the sleek bushmaster snake slide next to me. The viper was as thick as my wrist, and I estimated it to be far longer than my 6-foot frame. I watched as it slowly crawled over my arm. I breathed in slowly and barely kept my cool as I realized that a bite could kill in minutes, and I was hours away from medical care, even if they had anti-venom at the settlement. I lay at its level and watched as it turned its massive angular head to me, inches from my face. The sides of its triangular head was enlarged to hold fatal amounts of venom. It stopped and looked me in the eyes. It flicked its tongue at me, licking my nose. And after a deliberate consideration, it turned back to the way it was going and disappeared at a leisurely pace into the bush. The whole time, I watched every inch of the thing glide by. I quietly wished it luck on its nightly hunt. Another hour passed by, and I watched a line of clouds slowly move in. I thought very little of it. I suddenly had an eerie feeling of being watched. I knew that was impossible because I had not moved from my prone position in the hide. Nothing nocturnal should know of my positioning other than the bushmaster and the mosquitoes. I felt a shudder hit me as I reimagined the sensation of the snake sliding over my arm. But I knew that my imagination was not what was bothering my instinct. I kept my eyes open, scanning the woods, when darkness suddenly descended as the clouds forsook the moon. Suddenly, the forest was alive with noise, as if waiting for true dark. I heard large creatures bounding through the woods. It wasn't the scurrying of something small, but rather the crash, pause, crash sound of something massive placing one foot down after another, and many of them. I fumbled to place my night vision goggles on my head, but stopped as I heard a thrashing in the high branches in the tree next to the one I rested against. I dared not place my goggles on my head, as the movement would give away my position to any creature with the vision to move so agilely in the trees at night. All was quiet, and then that tree thrashed twice as if two large beasts jumped from it. I then could feel the impact of their bodies through the thick trunk that my body rested against. I slow rolled my eyeballs up and moved my head so that I could see the branches above me, but could see nothing through the dense foliage and the darkness. I wondered what creature could be above me. Panthers? I could only tighten my grip on my firearm, as I dared not make any movement to place on my goggles, even in my camouflaged hide. After a while, my neck began to hurt from holding my head up, but again I dared not move. I regretted my decision to set up with the focus of my vision on the valley below. I was not anticipating anything in the trees above. It sounded like the forest floor around me was getting ravaged by an army of large animals. In the suddenly moonless night, my arms and neck trembled from keeping my eyes on the branches above and the handgun in my hand, but I was still unable to see any of the creatures. I felt the tree shudder and heard the foliage above thrash as if a large animal leapt from it, and then I heard something crashing through the upper branches of the trees from one to another until the sound disappeared into the distance. I saw that the cloud bank was passing, and whatever accursed creatures were out there seemed to be running away. The moon reappeared, and all was suddenly silent, yet I dared not move. I knew that I felt the impacts of two large bodies hit the tree above me, and I only felt one leave. Something still lurked 40 feet above me. The muscles of my neck were excruciatingly sore, but still, I dared not move my head. The hood with my mosquito net plastered itself against my face. My forehead, cheeks, and nose were getting eaten up by the mosquitoes. But I didn't slap them, nor scratch my face. I regretted my decision not to wear insect repellent again for fear of giving away my position with the scent foreign to the jungle. Each time an impulse would hit to scratch my face, I could hear my craziest drill instructors from Marine Corps boot camp and later officer candidate school screaming at us when caught scratching our faces. One in particular would yell, "If you scratch your face, your movement just gave away your position, and you got killed. I don't care about you because you're stupid. I care about the good Marines in your company, who you just killed with your lack of discipline." I kept my discipline and suffered with the pain and let it go. I kept reminding myself that no one had survived the night in this area since the excavation began. My body kept tensing in anticipation of whatever was in the tree above to pounce on me, but nothing happened. I began to try to convince myself that the two distinct noises were actually caused by one creature. I slowly began to believe myself, as all stayed silent. If something lurked above, it had more discipline than I did, and that it hadn't moved yet. As the hours passed, I slowly lowered my face and scratched it when I was sure that the forest was cleared. I froze in my scratch as I heard a loud snort above me as soon as my hand touched my face. The animal sounded as large as a horse. I cursed Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Huey in my head. He was right, and I slowly brought my hand down, back to a two-handed grip on my handgun, and waited for an attack from whatever was watching me from above. But nothing happened. Again, doubts about a beast in the tree above began to flood my head. Dawn was less than an hour away. I watched another bank of clouds move in. I heard something relatively small crash through the foliage and the branches above. Whatever it was, it crashed to the ground 3 feet from me. It sounded like a stone the size of my fist, and it made an odd splatting sound. The night vision goggles lay in front of me. I decided as soon as the moon was hidden, I would place the goggles on as fast as I could. If it gave away my position, I would simply fight anything that attacked. After all, whatever was above me knew that I was laying there. The goggles were made of the latest technology. They had not only night vision, but infrared, as well as, depending upon the mechanical setting, they would also film whatever I saw. Maybe it was my exhaustion in the late hour, but in that moment I was prepared to give my life to get footage of that damn chupacabra, if that was what it was, in the tree above. The clouds were moments away from covering the moon when something large leapt from my tree to another. I placed on my goggles and tried to follow the crashing 40 feet above, but whatever it was avoided even the video capabilities and enhanced vision of our latest technology. I now truly felt alone. In the 30 minutes before sunrise, I began to notice the faint scent of excrement, so faint that I thought I was imagining it. I watched the sun rise, and a feeling of relief and exhaustion overwhelmed me. As soon as the sun brought that feeling of safety, I fell asleep. I awoke a little after 10 in the morning. I quickly bundled up my gear and placed it in my small backpack. As I did so, I noticed the faint smell of excrement again, and looked a few feet away from my hide, where I had heard the mysterious object fall from above during the night, and saw that it looked like a rat turd, except it was smashed slightly on one end, like it had fallen 40 feet. And worst of all, instead of being a half-inch, it was nearly a foot long. I quickly packed and explored my surroundings, and saw a trail of disturbed leaves. I mentally remembered where I saw a faint trail, and walked to the creek. In the humid heat, my blood felt choked in icy terror as I saw in the sand prints that reminded me of a rat, except it belonged to a creature that had to weigh close to my 180 pounds, by the depth that it sank into the earth. And worst of all, there were prints of at least 12 different animals of this kind. I swore as I nervously looked around. Despite knowing that I was probably safe by daylight, I still worried. I was determined to see where the trail led to, and then leave before dark. Then I would return with a platoon of armed men and wipe out whatever these creatures were off the face of the earth. I went back to the main trail. The area was pretty torn up from the night before, at least to my trained eyes. I only had a few times where I had to stop and truly study to see where the trail led. A half-mile away, the trail suddenly stopped at a rock formation in a hill. I walked concentric circles around the area where the trail had stopped, but discovered no resumption within a 50-foot radius. With a determined sigh, I walked back to where I lost the trail. I only had 4 hours until sunset, and I was probably an hour sprint from my drop-off point. I could not leave now due to my curiosity, but I had no idea where to go. The trail ended at the rocks. My body was eaten up by something that reminded me of the chiggers back in Missouri. It covered me from head to toe. My face and hands were eaten up by mosquitoes. I felt nasty, itchy, and in desperate need of a shower. I was actually afraid of spending another night alone in the jungle, especially since I was sure that whatever was in the tree above me uncannily knew that I was watching it. In my itchy and frustrated madness, I had the feral impulse to kick the rock formation, but I withheld that tantrum and considered that ghosts who disappear into rock do not leave trails in the leaves and sand. I studied the rock formation and pushed and pulled in a few areas. On a lower section, I pushed a rock that seemed as if it was slightly polished from manipulation. A sheen of natural skin oil glossed it. I pushed on it, and it gave slightly. I stepped back in shock as a stone rolled away, exposing an entrance into a cave. As I knelt and studied the mechanism, I could see that it was made by intelligent hands. The rock that I moved had a rope tied in a hole that was carved out. The rope then disappeared into the formation. I ducked and stepped into the hole that was left from the rolled stone. I had to scramble in as the roof was at my waist height. I clambered down the chute. The passage was constructed of slabs of stone, perfectly carved and fitted together. Oddly, the ceiling was just barely over a meter from the floor, causing me to waddle in a combat squat. It was too low to walk with a slight stoop, but neither did I wish to crawl on all fours like a groveling beast. However, my thighs soon began to burn of the uncomfortable position of the crouch, and after a while I holstered my Glock and crawled on all fours. As I followed the downward passage, I tried to understand the nature of the tunnel. Although it was obviously formed by human hands, I wondered why they would have had such a low ceiling. I thought perhaps it was a sewer or something for running water, but I caught no scent of ancient rancidness, nor was there any sign of water flowing through here, even in ancient times. There were also perfectly carved stair steps to allow the flow of human feet rather than water. But the center of the stones used as stairs were rounded down as if used by feet for more than 1,000 years. The rounded areas glistened with natural skin oil from the feet of unknown men or creatures. I stopped at a corner in the downward passage, and from my hands and knees I admired the skill of the stone carvers and fitters. The walls were carved smooth as glass in a curved fashion, and painted from antiquity was a primordial jungle scene whose inhabitants were rat-like creatures. The paintings, though faded with age, were as vivid as photos, and in a style like nothing that I had witnessed before. It certainly was not like the artistic styles of any indigenous tribes in the area. A chill hit me. An errant thought taunted my imagination that this passage was not designed for people, and possibly not even built by human hands. After traversing down the chute for a few hundred meters, I soon found myself in a gigantic hall. I now could stand upright. I looked at my watch and realized my descent had taken me much longer than it should have, from having taken time to study the odd architecture and art. I shined my flashlight around the chamber and gasped as I realized that the room had to be the size of a football field, maybe two fields set side by side. My pocket flashlight that I used could not reach the distant corners. I marveled as I saw that great pillars painted with artwork supported a ceiling that was high enough for me to stand, but low enough that I could still touch it. I saw reliefs painted on the walls that told a story. I turned my penlight to study them. I had to bend over to look at the paintings, as the artist had to have been seated on the stone floor when drawing. I was perplexed as I tried to make sense of the drawing. The oddity was not that the drawings were hard to understand. On the contrary, the artist or artists were talented, and I could see clearly what they were drawing to the finest detail. The perplexing part was figuring out the allegory of the stories. The drawings centered around rat-like creatures. I wondered if the people who drew the fresco envisioned their gods as rat-like beings, but these gods were not all powerful. They were fluffy, almost cuddly looking, yet their fangs and claws marked them as quite formidable and bestial. Even so, the way the artist painted the light in the beady rodent eyes gave the impressions of unmistakable human-like intelligence. Although I appreciate art, I am not blessed with the talent to put on paper what I envision in my head. Something about the way the rats in the painting looked at each other, or the objects that they were working on, demonstrated a degree of an emotion, curiosity, perplexion, and even, if I dare say, at times humor. I followed the wall of the drawings as the rats developed from forest creatures fearful of snakes, jungle cats, and reptilian creatures that were long extinct if they ever existed. The rats then found refuge in stone tunnels that they made. The paintings showed the rats with tools for stoneworking and their claws. It showed them constructing the tunnels in this very room, and then they labored to bury them. I felt an involuntary shiver as it showed them constructing the curved part of the tunnel that I had explored. I told myself that it couldn't be the same tunnel, but the height of the rats in the pictures showed them at the perfect height for crawling through the tunnels. On all fours, it would have given them a few inches above their backs. I shivered again as I pictured them in my head, sprinting at me at a full run as I scrambled at a slow pace on my hands and knees. After following a few rock panels, I finally found a slab that showed people. It demonstrated them wearing reptilian yet ghoulishly human masks. They weren't drawn with the same majesty of the Mayan carvings. The people wearing the mask appeared as mortal men. Their masks were a plain facade, a painfully chintzy facade that was made with the intention to strike fear in the rats, but failed. It showed the men and the rats making a contract on stone. It showed the men building the pyramid, as the rats watched from the tops of trees and hills. I caught my breath in the next one. It showed the men launching adalel darts and spears from afar into the backs of the rats. The savagery in the eyes of the men and the pain and suffering of the rats got to my heart. The artist was very poignant in the storytelling. At first I felt like I was reading a text. Then it became like seeing it live. I could hear the screams of warfare and slaughter as I had experienced them in my own deployments in the past. The next painting showed, under a moon that looked like a bitten-off fingernail, the rats on the move in the dark. They invaded the houses of the people and attacked them face to face with teeth and claws. I could see the savagery of the damage with every bite and slash, but the artist demonstrated the heroic nature of the slaughter with an edge that struck me as propaganda. The slaughter of the people was a total rout. The next scene showed the rats carrying baskets of dirt to bury the town and the pyramid itself. It showed the rats filling the containers with rodent-like kicks from their back feet. The propaganda effect was so intense that I found myself both inspired by the rats and full of hate for my own humankind. The next panel showed various scenes of the rats living at peace in the forest, dealing with floods, occasional internal battles between rats, and other issues that didn't develop into the intensity of the conflict with the pyramid builders. I continued to follow the walls and saw occasional conflicts with other humans. These were now dressed as Spanish conquistadors, with steel clothing and helmets and their fire sticks. The first such painting showed very little understanding of the workings of a firearm. Indeed, it looked like a flaming stick that killed the rats from afar, again in a cowardly manner. It showed the men running in fear from the barred teeth and 4-inch claws when face to face with the rats at night. But after a few panels, I saw the firearms showing the working mechanisms of the flintlocks and an uncanny understanding by the artist. It was at this time I realized that I had looked over 1,000 years of history, yet the mural flowed together without any noticeable change in styles or signatures, as if completed by a single artist who had witnessed everything firsthand. I walked to the beginning again and saw that the paintings of the primordial forest was indeed much older and faded, as if painted from a time before Christ himself walked the earth. I followed it again and saw that the drawings looked fresher and fresher. I caught another chill when the mural showed a meek little rat painting on the wall with its paint belt wrapped around its abdomen that held the tools of its trade. There was something about the eyes that I knew I had seen that particular rat in some other paintings, and I would recognize the same rat again as I continued my tour. I looked above and noticed that the gray stone of the ceilings were not scorched black with fires from cooking nor torchlight. How is this painted? I asked myself. I turned off my flashlight and saw that the weak light filtered downward from air vents, but it was not enough for any human to have painted this masterpiece without the light of fire. I followed the wall and saw a painting with a monstrous old car and the driver getting torn apart by heroic-looking rats. I felt a cold sweat break across my brow as I saw an archaeologist digging over the buried pyramid. I saw the 3 policemen getting savaged by the rats. I then swore as I saw a man lying in the leaves. An ice-cold fist gripped my spine as my hand touched my own hat. I saw it painted on the man's head. It was my hat and my face. I squinted as I saw that the painter made my eyes intense like those of a killer. I looked at the firearm that I held, and it was similar in reproduction, even to the brand name. The letters were drawn, written as if slurred by a hand that replicated the basic shape without realizing the meaning of the symbols. In the painting, a rat that was about my size sat in the tree above me, studying me. I knew it was the same rat that had painted its self-portrait earlier. In my growing terror, a new thought struck me. I impulsively looked at my watch. It was just a few minutes before sunset. I had to get out now. However, I couldn't leave just yet. Fearfully, I reached forward and touched the painting of myself and felt the wet smear of paint on my fingertips. I was expecting it, of course, but it still shocked me that I was part of its history that spanned to the primordial dawn of this non-human civilization. I feared how I would be drawn next. I rubbed my paint-sticky fingers together and swore as I heard a rustle behind me. I whipped around and shined my light and saw 100 pairs of rodentia beady eyes reflecting redly back at me. They stood on their hind legs and slowly crept forward on the 2 legs. They were hunched over with their long black claws under their long yellow front incisors. In this forward haunch, they stood about at the height of my chest. With their animalistic power, claws, and teeth, I doubted that I could barely take on one of them at a time, let alone an army. I had a sense of their humanity from the drawings, but I quickly dumped that from my mind as I backed up. I could hear a massive growling that sounded like they were grinding their teeth together as they matched my retreating speed, step by step. But they looked on edge, ready to pounce, en masse, at the slightest provocation. I held up my hands and said, "Whoa, whoa, I mean you no harm." But even if they could understand my words, I realized that I invaded their home. I saw cute little rat cubs behind them, and I knew my own paternal instinct would have filled my mind with rage to kill any of them if I found them in my home of my loved ones. I was also aware that the paintings had indoctrinated them to see me as their mortal enemy, and with good reason. I pulled my gun and aimed it at the mass of rodents and ordered, "Halt!" in the authoritative voice I acquired from my time in the Marine Corps. They stopped and backed up a few steps. I immediately turned around and darted blindly down a passage. I had no idea where it led. I hate to admit it, that I had no other choice, and that panic is what drove me. I was able to run upright for 50 meters through the passage and kept well ahead of my pursuers. I believed that I had a chance if I could just get to the outside air. However, the walls began to narrow, and the ceiling dropped drastically, closing in on me. I soon had to drop to all fours and scrambled as fast as I could with my flashlight in one hand and handgun in the other. My speed reduced by half. I could hear the padded feet of my pursuers rapidly gaining on me over the worn stone steps. Over the soft slab, I heard countless clicks of their sharpened claws. I felt as if a fist clenched my heart and squeezed away any hope as the tunnel grade declined sharply. The angle wasn't so steep as to cause me to fall or slow my pace, but it took me deeper into the bowels of my enemy's lair. However, with them snapping at my heels, I had no choice but to continue my direction for temporary safety despite unavoidable ultimate doom from going deeper. I scrambled onward until one of my feet refused to move forward and my body crashed face first into the rock floor. I rolled over onto my back and saw that one of the giant rats had a claw stuck into my heel of my right boot. It squealed horridly as I twisted my leg and wrenched its furry wrist. It let go, leaving a bloody 5-inch claw stuck into the hard rubber. I scurried backwards like a crab. The tunnel narrowed so that only two of them could come at me abreast. When they rushed, I slammed a boot into one of their faces as I continually scooted deeper and deeper into their home. This went on for a few minutes as I simply bought time, putting off the inevitable doom. As long as I could hold them off with my boots, I saved my bullets. I had a distant hope that if I could see any way out, I would use my firearm for a final run or a final stand. I resolved to take as many of them with me. My biggest worry was whether I would save a final bullet for my own end, or for a final one to kill these rodents before they shredded me. Suddenly, they quit their pursuit. I stopped as well and studied the two rats on the vanguard. Their beady eyes stared past me. I shined my light down the decline and saw two pairs of red eyes coming at me to sandwich me in. Behind them was a rolling mass of rats. I scrambled toward my newcomers as I saw a side passage ahead. I rolled over and sprinted, hunched over. My pursuit from the rear picked up again, and I felt their claws slicing at my boots. The ones coming to meet me ran at twice my speed. I would never make it to the side passage before them, but I could not stop. I met them at the entrance and shouldered into two of them, knocking them back a few inches, taking two horrible gashes to my scalp and shoulder. But I squeezed into the side passage, falling onto my back. I kicked one of the rats in the face and kept kicking. In the new passage, only one creature could follow me at a time. I saw a wooden beam that supported a large boulder. I kicked the support twice, causing the beam to give out and produce a cave-in at the entrance. I scooted backward in a frenzy to escape getting crushed by stone, and the back of my head slammed into a rock wall. I shined my light around and cursed as I found myself in a small room. It was 15 feet long, maybe 4 feet wide, maybe 2.5 feet high. I was temporarily safe, but trapped. I could hear them digging at the boulder intently, with furious scraping of an army of giant digging rodents. The high-pitched screeching sound of their deadly nails scratching on the stone obscenely assaulted my ears and nerves. Toward the cave-in, and on the ceiling, I saw a board that was 4 feet by 4 feet. I scrambled toward it and hoped that it was a possible door to a way out. I was half right. It was a door. However, before I could touch it, it slid toward me, as if on its own accord, and a rat dropped through the opening, with more behind it. From my supine position, I used my foot to slam the ceiling door back in place before another of those accursed beasts could join me. I accomplished that with a thunderous clatter, and turned my attention to the creature in the room. Its sinews were bunched and ready to spring as I turned my handgun at its face. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I stopped. I do not know what mastered my finger in that split second, but I temporarily could not kill the creature before me. I studied it, and could see what I had never seen in an animal before. Its head was bowed submissively, but what I saw in its eyes forever changed me. It had fear, yes, but it also had a look that I had only seen in humans. There was a profound knowledge of its own mortality, not just fear of pain. I held my aim, but could not finish the deed. As it crouched before me, cowering and flinching, anticipating the lead rounds to puncture its flesh, it finally, apprehensively, looked up at me. I instantly recognized that it was the painter. Indeed, I saw the belt around its waist, with its paints and brushes. Through what evidence I do not know, but I knew it was a female. It wasn't smaller, nor was the face more diminutive or graceful, nor could I see the genitals and the fur, but I knew it was female. Not that it mattered, but I felt better calling this intelligent creature she rather than it. She studied my face and saw my eyes look up to the hatchway above, and the scurrious scratching of the giant rodents above. With a few sharp, commanding squeaks from her, the racket ceased, as the rodents beyond the door squeaked back to her. She cocked her head as I tried to communicate, but she did not understand my language, nor could I comprehend her series of oddly articulated squeaks. She also tried to communicate with head and claw gestures, but again I was confused. I found myself getting rigid in fear of miscommunication. Who knew how she would interpret a simple nod or shaking of my head? An attempt at a friendly, toothy smile may be interpreted as a fang-bearing snarl, a handshake as an attempt to grab. However, I did comprehend her intent as she lowered her claws to the ground, almost as if performing a prostration. I, in turn, lowered my firearm. We simply looked at each other. I found myself overwhelmed by the feeling of immense wisdom of this thing from this remote jungle. Yes, I was well-traveled, well-educated, had flown in airplanes and operated devices inconceivable to these creatures. I had used computers, had access to knowledge beyond the ken of this creature's imagination. However, I could only sense the antiquity of her. If the paintings were correct, if she had painted those scenes from the primordial age of this forest, I could only guess at the deeper understandings of this creature, who had lived at least a few thousand years. This may have been one of the creatures that was behind the legend of the chupacabra. It was not in any way ugly besides the obvious bared teeth and claws, but I could see how its crouched shape, when viewed in the darkness, and eldritch-inspired imagination could be seen as grotesque and nightmarish. However, if I was introduced to it as someone's pet, once the shock of curiosity was sated, I would feel an overpowering urge to pet it, as I did now. However, I felt that such an approach would be seen as patronizing and insulting to this ancient creature before me. I was shaken from my musing as she got up from her prostrations and resumed her crouch. She slowly stepped towards me. I raised my gun and aimed it as she fearlessly stepped closer. I knew that it still saw me as an intruder. "Stop," I pleaded. She ignored me. Regretfully, I began to pull the trigger. It was night as I stumbled back into the outskirts of the town of Yavisa. The claw-induced gashes on my scalp and shoulder had soaked my clothes in so much blood that despite the dark camouflage coloring of my clothes and soiled in dirt, it was obvious to all who witnessed my approach that I had been through hell. I had a noticeable limp, not due to tremendous leg pain, although there was some, but rather from a missing boot heel that was removed with a savage swipe of one of those terrible claws. I was immediately taken to Chief Ramos's house. I told him nothing, but let him see the terror in my eyes. Usually people see me as stoic. It's not an act, but rather I simply choose not to show my emotion on my face or in my body. A military commander is not allowed the luxury of showing his feelings. It will compromise the mission and lose the faith his men have in him, resulting in a loss of life. In this case, I let Ramos see that I had witnessed horror. He seemed to respect when I refused to say what I saw, but rather handed him the bloody 5-inch claw that had been stuck in my boot. "How did you escape?" I wearily shook my head and answered, "By God's mercy, and no skill of my own." "I see," he said. "You were wise to avoid that area, Senor. I would advise others to do the same, and the killings would stop. But that is the only way." He nodded, and the area was declared off limits. I was on a flight out of Panama within an hour. From the safety of my study, I finished writing this. I put this down on paper with hesitation and great deliberation. My job is to make sense of the weird, the paranormal, the unexplainable, and to broadcast it. In this case, I know enough to understand, but also enough to drive me insane that I cannot learn more. I had to write this, if only to make sense of it. But I may destroy this paper only to prevent the curious from disturbing what should be left alone. In that stone vault, hundreds of feet beneath the jungle, and the burrows of hundreds of creatures who wanted me dead, that artistic creature walked towards me, despite my gun, aimed at her head. My finger tightened on the trigger as she neared me. But it was only by God's grace that I did not fire it as she squeezed past me. Her soft fur brushed my face, and I could smell the clean scent of wild jungle on her. She reached past me and pulled a small rock that allowed the back wall to roll away. She unfurled her deadly 4-inch long nails, which clicked near my face, and she pointed upward. I saw a chimney-like passageway reaching from the deep earth to the heavens. I looked at her, and we held the understanding that our peoples were at war, but it was not between us. As much as I wished to stay and learn, I gratefully climbed towards the stars far above. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, if you like my work, please like, subscribe, and share. And if you wish to support my work, check out the links in the description below and buy one of my 4 novels. And again, I'd like to thank my friend Mark Ernst for helping me critique this story. And I'll have 1 or 2 stories coming out every week. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.